Good evening. I'm Rula Khalaf. I'm foreign editor at the Financial Times. And we're here for a discussion on Iraq at a very critical moment in the country's history. We've got a great panel for you. I only have one very small request, which is that you keep your phones on silent. And that during the Q&A, if you could just state your name and your affiliation and ask a question rather than make a speech. Thank you. We will start our discussion with Haidar El-Khoui, who's an associate fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. He's a doctoral student at the London School of Economics and a fellow at the Iraq Energy Institute and at Forward Thinking. Haidar has just come back from Baghdad, and he'll be telling us about where we are in this conflict. Professor Toby Dodge has been asked, is director of the Middle East Center at the LSE, deputy director of LSE Ideas, and a professor in International Relations Department. He is the author of Iraq from War to a New Authoritarianism. Our third speaker is Dr. Nusayba Yunus. She is an International Security Program Research Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. She received her PhD from the University of Durham, where her dissertation focused on the relationship between state weakness and foreign policy making in post-invasion Iraq. Haidar, could you bring us up to date on the latest events in Iraq?
Thank you, Rula. What I'll try to be doing today is making three basic points and touching on three main areas. Firstly, what happened in Mosul, number one. Number two, is this a sectarian crisis? And number three, I think the much misunderstood fatwa by Ayatollah Sistani, the call to arms to fight. I'll just start by saying it's not clear what actually happened in Mosul last week. Reports that commanders gave orders for the army to withdraw. Others say the army received no orders and the leadership collapsed, so they decided to flee at the first sight of the jihadists. Now we have dozens of senior army officers who have been relieved of their duties and court-martialed. So I think in the coming weeks we will have more details on the exact circumstances of the fall of Mosul. You know, whether it was a betrayal, whether or not they were bribed, or were they just scared. What we do know is that ISIS is not working alone in Iraq. It's simply not possible for hundreds of militants to rout tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers and take a city of the size of Mosul, Iraq's third largest city, without local support from civilians as well as other armed groups. Now, ISIS may be spearheading this movement, but that's because they are the most high profile, the most extreme, and they run a very slick propaganda machine that amplifies their voice and makes them seem much bigger than they really are. But also because there are other powerful forces who are taking a back seat and who shy away from the limelight. I just want to be clear about one thing, and that's for the most powerful of these insurgent groups, this has absolutely nothing to do with winning more rights for the Sunni Arab communities. This is about overthrowing a government, plain and simple, regardless of whether Maliki is prime minister or not prime minister. In fact, regardless of whether the prime minister is Shi'i or Sunni. And that's because they just simply do not believe in the democratic process. And it's important not to forget that. So we can sit here and debate, as I'm sure we will, how Maliki's policies have contributed to this crisis. But it is now much bigger than just about Maliki. And one of the best summaries I have ever heard over the last week came from a Kuwaiti analyst, Sami al-Nisif, who said, and I quote, "This started before Maliki and it will continue after Maliki." The groups fighting have a common enemy in the central government, but their ideologies are simply not compatible with each other. ISIS, the Islamic State, want to establish a caliphate and impose strict Islamic law, and the Ba'athists want to return to the pre-2003 order in which they reigned supreme. Now, of course, these two things can't happen at the same time. So I think we can expect a lot of bloodshed in the coming weeks between them, even as they fight the central government. Question number two, is this a sectarian crisis? I don't think this is a sectarian war, but it is most definitely a war that includes sectarian actors, amongst other actors. In other words, it is undeniable that there are sectarian elements deeply involved in this war, but the dominant narrative, and the one we are being fed constantly by the mainstream media, is simply too simplistic and too reductionist. And I would argue that it is dangerous because it can help reinforce perceptions that are divorced from reality. I do not want to argue sectarianism does not exist in Iraq. Of course it does. But there are important nuances that I think can be made to challenge this dominant narrative, and I'll try to go through them quickly. Number one, several high-profile Sunni clerics have come out very strongly against ISIS. Now, of course, they may not all support the Iraqi government, but there can be no doubt that they see ISIS as an enemy to all Iraqis, including, of course, their own Sunni community. Number two, Iraq's leading Sunni politicians, the ones who have been elected by the people, not the ones picking up guns and claiming to represent the people. 2 days ago, met at a national unity meeting along with their Shia and Kurdish partners and rivals to condemn ISIS as a terrorist group and declare them an enemy for all Iraqis. And again, that's not to say they support the government. And in fact, it was reported that Nujayfi, the Sunni Speaker of Parliament, al-Maliki, the Shia Prime Minister, did not exchange a single word during the meeting. But they did issue a joint statement. And I think I would just add that ISIS here have managed to accomplish something neither the Americans or the Iranians could. And that's to get all these people into one room and agree on the same thing. Number three, ISIS kills Sunnis too. Many of the car bombs go off in Sunni areas, in mixed neighborhoods, and they are victims. And ISIS also targets Sunni tribal fighters who are fighting alongside the Iraqi armed forces against ISIS. And in a recent summary execution by one of the North African ISIS jihadists, and this is on YouTube, he lines up Iraqi soldiers and then shoots one of them in cold blood and then taunts the others and asks them what was his sectarian affiliation. And of course he goes on to kill the others as well. They don't care, Shia, Sunni. It's extremism, and this is the type of brutality that the Iraqi government and regional neighbors and international community has to be prepared to combat. And it's simply too simplistic to call ISIS Sunni jihadists. I mean, technically that's true, but it is not very helpful in understanding who these guys are. ISIS are violent extremist Salafis. They are a tiny minority within a minority who are the Salafis within mainstream Sunni Islam. Finally, just on the Sistani fatwa, and I'll try to be as quick as I can. Last Friday, Sistani declared publicly a call to arms for Iraqis to join the armed forces. And this had immediate impact on the ground. And I was there last week, and morale was really broken after Mosul fell and Tikrit fell. The people, very few people were smiling. And after the Sistani fatwa, you could immediately feel the impact. Spirits were lifted, there was a buoyancy, and people began to think that actually, ISIS are an exaggeration and we can confront them. Now, the world paid attention to the Sistani fatwa because not even during the darkest days of the civil and sectarian war did Sistani issue a call to arms. Even when they destroyed the Shia sacred shrine in Samarat, he constantly said to the Shia, calm down. And I think the media misconstrued his fatwa as a Shia call to arms against Sunnis rather than an Iraqi call to arms against terrorism. And I'm not here talking about Middle Eastern media. I think for many they are beyond the pale. No serious observer goes to the regional media as a source for impartial news, though they're not completely useless because it gives you an idea of what a particular government or political party or businessman thinks. However, I do think the Western media should be held to a higher standard. Thank you.
On that note, thank you. Toby, what Haider is essentially describing is a political crisis in Iraq. Can you take us back a little bit to explain how we got here?
Sure. I suppose, like Haider, I've been given 7 minutes to cut through a tidal wave of information that's swept us away over the last couple of weeks. So I thought I'd organise my thoughts around 3 questions. Like Haider, what does the revolt actually represent? Why did the army collapse so quickly in Mosul? And what are the underlying political dynamics driving this conflict? And again, I agree with Haider. Obviously, estimates about ISIS's size are very difficult. 3,000 in 2013, the top figure that I could find is 8,000 now. It's clearly not ISIS on its own, or even possibly primarily driving what has become a widespread revolt across the north and the northwest of Iraq. And if we look at voices coming from Mosul after the Iraqi army left, or today a report from Patrick Coburn from Hib near Bakuba, 40 miles to the northeast of Baghdad, what we see is a gathering impression that people have expressed, those people who haven't fled because of the fear of ISIS have expressed relief that the Iraqi army has been driven out. Now, what possibly could lead to this sense that the insecurity of revolt and the possible undoubted horrors of ISIS could be greeted with relief? And I think what we've seen, especially after the 2010 elections, but going into the aftermath of the 2014 elections, is a section of the Iraqi population that have been through a series of very bad experiences, have given up hope on the Iraqi state. They've been excluded from the Iraqi state, and that they've seen the Iraqi army in Mosul and then coming down through the north and the northwest as an army of occupation. And so when a myriad of violent groups, from ISIS through the Naqshbandis to ex-military officers to armed people within society, step forward, instead of saying, no, we will reject you and we'll fight for the government, they've either, the majority sat on their hands, or some of them said, well, maybe this could offer a possible alternative to what has been a long-running campaign of military repression in the north and the northwest. So I think that's the background against which this revolt has exploded. Now, undoubtedly, as Haider says, this temporary, if it is a unity, this temporary relief will be replaced. I think ISIS's brand of an extreme Islamism, with its beheading, with its chopping off of hands, with its violence, as we've seen in Raqqa and Syria, and across where they've dominated, clearly will divide the population, will drive the population from it. And we've already seen extended reports of ISIS and the Naqshbandis fighting each other for the dominance of areas. But this we could see as a cycle. If we go back to 2004-05, we see the gathering speed of an insurgency against the occupation and the nascent governing structures it was building, with then Al-Qaeda in Iraq taking responsibility for a series of atrocities that it couldn't have perpetrated on its own. And then we see Al-Qaeda in Iraq then gathering control over areas like Anbar by 2005, and that triggering a revolt against it by 2006, the so-called awakening that was picked up by Petraeus and the American forces in the surge and pushed forward as an intelligence gathering. So I'm sure this revolt will flounder. I'm sure, actually, once the Iraqi forces have recouped, they'll be able to push back from Samarra up through to Crete without much difficulty, but they will be facing a population that is clearly hostile to the Iraqi army and doesn't see it as a deliverer of law and order, equality, or a guarantor of citizenship. Which brings us on to the second question about why that very same army collapsed so much. Now, the Americans poured billions of dollars into the Iraqi army, rebuilt it very quickly from 2004 onwards. The budget that the Iraqi government has poured into the Iraqi army trebled from 2009 to 2012. The Iraqi army and the Ministry of Interior has nearly 1 million men under arms, equivalent to 8% of the entire workforce, or 12% of the total population of the adult males. Why did this huge, heavily invested army collapse? I think it's fairly clear that what Maliki has done from 2006 is coup-proof the army. Like many leaders across the Middle East, pull it apart, break its chain of command, and break its esprit de corps. Now Maliki then set up the office of the Commander-in-Chief, and then he set up provincial security offices that coordinated the police and the army in each of the provinces these were set up in. Again, breaking the chain of command and putting one general appointed by his office in charge of these forces. Now, if you were to set out to break the coherence and the capacity of the Iraqi army, you'd do that. And after that, after the sacking of the head of the Iraqi intelligence service who'd been trained by the United States, he did something similar with the Iraqi intelligence services. And now we have a series of Iraqi intelligence services competing with each other. So if you interview senior security figures at the highest ranks of the Iraqi security service, you ask them the rather impertinent question that as a bit of a train spotter fascinates me, when did you get the ability to lift signal intelligence? When could you bug people's mobile phones? And the answer comes back, about 3 or 4 years ago. The Americans sold us that technology. But we can't analyze and deliver actionable intelligence from it because we're not coherent enough. So the Iraqi army is fractured and it is blind. Where did this sense of political alienation, institutional incoherence and crisis come from? I think it came, if we were going to set a moment, the day when all these came together to deliver this crisis, I'd pick December 2012 going into January 2013. This is when Rafi al-Asawi, a popular finance minister, the senior most member of the Iraqi coalition who got 91 seats in the 2010 election, was driven from the cabinet on what is generally assumed to be trumped-up charges of terrorism. That triggered a series of popular mobilizations, not violent, across the northwest in Ramadi, in Fallujah, spreading across Sunni-majority areas. And you can see why. In 2010, in the aftermath of what we thought was the end of the Iraqi civil war, in the aftermath of the awakening, when the surge and the Iraqi forces had brought some order, Iraqi Sunnis or Iraqi secularists, Iraqi nationalists invested in that March 2010 elections heavily in the ballot box. They sent their MPs to parliament, and from that elongated negotiation period to November to November 2010, with the Erbil agreement, there was another government of national unity. Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister, picked off first Tariq al-Hashimi, then Rafi al-Asawi, then encouraging the division of Iraqia within parliament, undermined that government of national unity, undermined the Erbil agreement that constituted that. In 2014, unsurprisingly, you see the vote for the remnants of Iraqia split between 3 electoral groupings dominated by personalities, Ayad Alawi, Salah al-Mutlaq, and Salman al-Jaifi, with much lower vote, much lower turnout in the Sunni-dominated areas. It's against this background, I think, in 2014, that this revolt was launched. And basically what ISIL and their fellow temporary travelers were saying was, in 2010, you invested in the democratic process. What did it get you? We're the only thing that stands between you and a vengeful Iraqi army. I think that's the profoundly depressing situation we find ourselves in, the failure of law and order, the failure of democracy, and the failure of the Iraqi army to deliver some form of stability across the whole of the country.
I'm sure we'll want to return to Prime Minister Maliki's handling of the Iraqi political scene in the last few years. But let's first try to look forward. Nusayba.
I believe that the events of the last week really represent a watershed moment in Iraqi history. The Kurdish Prime Minister Nashirvan Barzani commented this week that there's a pre-Mosul Iraq and a post-Mosul Iraq. But there's also a legitimate fear that Iraq simply won't survive. The storming of Mosul was a dramatic moment in a wider campaign of violence in Iraq designed to make the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham into a territorial reality. ISIS fighters, who've been significantly strengthened by their success in the Syrian civil war, came back to Iraq to exploit Sunni grievances against the Maliki government. As Toby Dodge has explained, throughout Maliki's second term in office, Iraqi Sunnis have become more and more alienated by the state. Threatened by the astonishing performance of Iraqi in the 2010 elections, Prime Minister Maliki decided that Iraqi would never again be allowed to successfully challenge his power. And he set about victimizing the mainstream Iraqi Sunni political leadership, perhaps not realizing or maybe not caring that he was simultaneously undoing the fragile political settlement that had ended Iraq's first civil war. After months of peaceful Sunni protests yielded few reforms, some Iraqi Sunni youth joined the ranks of ISIS, and some Sunni tribes threw their support behind renewed violence against the Iraqi state. Together with the Ba'athist Jaish al-Naqshbandiyya and a number of rebel Sunni tribal leaders and a smattering of other small groups, ISIS has been able to occupy significant territory in western and northern Iraq, and the Iraqi army has so far failed to roll back these gains. Although ISIS is not the only armed group involved in this fight, it is leading the charge. In fact, as Haider was talking about earlier, there are indeed irreconcilable differences between the Iraqi tribes, the Ba'athist Jaish al-Naqshbandiyya, and the hardcore Islamist ISIS. And an internal fight for control over the rebellion between these groups is inevitable. But without external support against ISIS, ISIS is bound to win such a battle, given its vast resource base and its pathological devotion to violence. So with the caveat that ISIS is not the only group involved, but simply the most powerful group involved, what we're seeing is a catastrophic advance of one of the most extreme peddlers of hate in the entire world. ISIS literally believes in the slaughter of everyone who doesn't share their extremely narrow set of beliefs, and most permanently is calling for the mass murder of Iraqi Shiites. Given the rapid advance of this terrifying group and the inability of the Iraqi security forces to defend Iraqi territory, we've seen thousands of Iraqi Shiites joining Shiite militias and joining the security forces, keen to defend themselves and defend their communities. And this is completely understandable. Iraqi militias have proven to be more effective than the Iraqi security forces in defending territory and in defeating ISIS in towns such as Samarra. But this brings with it also an enormous risk. Militias are extremely difficult to control, and with the kind of vitriolic sectarian sentiments that are being peddled by ISIS, it's very easy to see indiscriminate revenge attacks against Sunni civilians just around the corner. When al-Qaeda in Iraq bombed the holy Shiite shrine in Samarra in 2006, furious Shiite militants roamed the streets killing Sunni civilians in retaliation. By some estimates, over 1,000 Sunnis were killed in that first night, which in turn sparked retaliatory attacks that plunged Iraq into the depths of a vicious civil war. I think there's every chance of this happening again, literally in the next few weeks. I think the mobilization of Shiite militias in mixed sect areas could well lead to some massacre of Sunni civilians, and that this is really beyond the control of Iraq's leaders. This will in turn strengthen Sunni support for ISIS in its atrocities against Shiite civilians. And this is really the worst possible outcome of the current crisis, that it could descend into a fully blown sectarian civil war in which ISIS gains more and more strength on the ground and more resources from the territory that it is increasingly able to capture. So how can we prevent the worst possible scenario from playing out? We've heard a lot about possible US airstrikes and about Iran and the US working together in Iraq. I think these are good options. Although Iran has played a negative role in Iraq in the past, along with a number of other regional powers, ultimately it's in Iran's interest to prevent the radical anti-Shiite group ISIS from gaining a foothold in Iraq. Iran has political leverage in the Iraqi political scene in a way in which the US simply doesn't have. And I think Iran needs to use that leverage to help forge a new national unity government with strong Sunni representation, in which the response to ISIS violence in Sunni areas is led by Sunnis. We need to draw on the lessons we've learned about counterinsurgency in order to defeat ISIS in Sunni territories. There are already some Sunni tribes working with the Iraqi government against ISIS, and more tribes need to be persuaded to turn against ISIS and to be persuaded that there is a future for Iraqi Sunnis in Iraq. I think the most effective weapon that the Iraqi government has in such counterinsurgency is to offer those Sunnis who side with the government effectively control over a federal region like that enjoyed by the Kurds. I think with the prospect of self-government and a future without sectarian security forces in their towns, and hopefully a growing realization that ISIS simply cannot offer anyone a future free of violence, that the US, Iran, and Iraq's political leaders might be able to drag Iraq back from the brink. Thank you.
Haider, Nusayba mentioned the mobilization of Shia militias. How concerned are you that as the militias take part in trying to check ISIS advances, what you end up with is a return to the worst years of violence to 2005, 2006?
I mean, lots of people are drawing the comparison and saying it's 2006, 2007 all over again. When I was there, I mean, you can see obviously increased visible military presence. I didn't see them myself, but I did hear about Shia militia checkpoints. But it's very much normal. It isn't as
what do you mean by normal?
I mean, people are going out, they're staying up late, they're going to restaurants. It's not like 2006 where at 6 p.m., 5 p.m. you lock yourself in your home and stay indoors because you're afraid of going out into the streets. Also, I think one big difference is that the militias now, I think, are much more disciplined than they were in 2006. And by that, I mean, some of them obviously have very strong political connections and much stronger connections with Iran. It's not as a free-for-all as it was in 2006. Having said that, of course, I share Nusayba's fears that if they do, and really only takes a few crazy people to do something crazy for it to trigger another all-out Sunni Shia war. And I'm also afraid ISIS will pull off another spectacular attack as they did in 2006 by demolishing the shrine in Samarra. Something like that, I think, will trigger an all-out sectarian war. We haven't reached that stage yet, and maybe I'm naive or too optimistic, and I don't think we will, because they're much more controlled.
Toby, is there a way of moving forward today in Iraq if Maliki remains prime minister?
There's a lot of optimistic and ill-informed commentary coming out of the US media, not the British media, about the ability to remove Maliki, with the US somehow and the ever-present Brett McGurk in Baghdad telling Maliki he must go, and off the boy goes to a quiet retirement in Iran. I think that'd be great, but I think it's not likely for a series of reasons. One, the State of Law coalition was the strongest party coming out of the elections, and that's undeniable. Maliki himself, I think, over 700,000 votes, with the State of Law getting over 1 million votes in Baghdad on its own. That's a hell of a democratic hurdle to overcome to remove him, I would have thought. Secondly, the US has little or no leverage in Iraq since departing at the end of 2011, and I think so they won't, I don't think, be able to. I'm a little bit uneasy about the idea of US-Iranian cooperation. Bring General Petraeus out of retirement and get him to work with Qasem Soleimani. Finally, they meet. This great love affair can be consummated. But what has Iran's policy advice been to Nouri al-Maliki since it unambiguously swung behind his premiership in 2010? It's been to break Iraq here, to keep the dominance of the Shia parties in government. And if not to pursue a sectarian agenda, then they've not advised him to shy away from it. So I think Iran, beyond this hopefully short-term crisis, Iranian, and this is pretty stating the obvious, I think, but let's state it anyway, for the US commentariat at least, Iran's medium to long-term interests in Iraq are directly opposed to the United States. So for bringing them together in some kind of grand coalition to save Iraq from what? To save Iraq from a series of policy decisions that both the Iranians and the current prime minister pursued. So I think that's a problem. I think a government of national unity would be a start. I think an even better start. Why don't we ask the prime minister to bring back Rafi al-Asawi, the popular finance minister whose sacking triggered all this, or his resignation after his house had been raided and he was driven from the cabinet. I think that would be a good thing.
But so much of the passions being expressed now in Iraq and really in the whole region are focused on Maliki. Nusayba, do you think there is a chance that he will go?
I really don't think there is a chance he can go. I mean, Maliki, in these elections, he topped his personal best and got about 720,000 personal votes, and he just so far eclipses any other politician in Iraq. And I think that he's achieved that status by whipping up sectarian hatred. I think he's done it in a way that's brought Iraq to this place. But at the same time, with the Shiite community in Iraq feeling under existential threat from this absolutely crazy group, I'm not sure that this is the time when you can persuade them that the popularly elected leader, though he may have only been elected by Iraqi Shiites, and though he may be personally responsible for the state that Iraq is in today, I'm not sure that you would get away with getting him to step down, and that another prime minister figure would be able to have legitimacy in the face of that kind of action.
Heather, you wanted to comment?
I just want to add, Toby made a brilliant point about it's not up to the Americans. I honestly think it's not even up to the Iranians. Maliki in 2014 isn't Ja'fari in 2006. He's much more entrenched. He has many more loyalists in all state sort of arms, especially the security intelligence. What I wanted to ask Toby is, do we sometimes not exaggerate the difference between the Americans and the Iranians? Because in Iraq, and I'm not talking about Syria or the wider Middle East, but in Iraq, they both support the same process. They both support the same government. In fact, they both support the same person, and they have a common enemy in ISIS. And it's not like we haven't seen this before. I mean, after 9/11, there was very obvious, neither the Iranians nor the Americans can deny they cooperated, at least on an intelligence basis, to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan through the Northern Alliance. Why can't it be done?
If we see ISIS not as the cause of this, but a symptom of a larger cause, a symptom of the abject failure of the Iraqi state to deliver security, citizenship, equality, government services to the Iraqi population. And then we step back and say, what advice has, I agree with you that in 2010, in a travesty of policy making, the United States backed Nouri al-Maliki's continuation because they backed stability. I think Iran backed Nouri al-Maliki as they coming out of the elections. They didn't back him going in because the threat from Iraqia to the stability that they backed was different. So, and now I think we see, as far as I understand it, though, I have no confirmation from Qasem Soleimani yet. If he's listening, he could ring up. They're still backing Nouri al-Maliki, where the United States clearly, as early on as January this year, have moved against Maliki. The United States policy was always to wait to the 2014 elections and let the Iraqi electorate do the job. The tragedy from 2010 to 2014, that very faulty system that the US built, collapsed under the weight that Maliki put on it, I would have thought.
I want to give, let's just give a chance for the audience to ask some questions. Okay. Gentleman here. Let's take 2 or 3 questions at the same time. Yeah, the gentleman here, gentleman there.
Frank Kelly, a member of Chatham House. Nobody has mentioned the Kurds. Will the Kurds seize the window of opportunity of a crisis of the Iraqi state? And do UDI, proclaim their own state, which after all, many Kurds have been wishing for a long time? And would that lead up to the breakup of Iraq? After all, Iraq was 3 vilayets of the Ottoman Empire. It's only the British who created it.
Thank you. That's a very important point. please, the gentleman there. At the end.
Thank you. Cho Kong from Shell. If we're heading into increased violence and conflict, how secure are the Shia areas in the south around Basra?
Thank you. The gentleman there.
Louis Al-Khatib, fellow Brookings Center. If we look into the key headlines that dominated the past 10 days, in my humble opinion, it's the fatwa of Grand Ayatollah Sistani. Now, I don't know how much journalists, analysts are aware of the gravity of this fatwa. If we look into the last 100 years, there are 3 key fatwas being issued by Najaf. The first one was 100 years ago. It was against the occupation and supporting, it's by Najaf, and supporting the mobilizing Iraqis to defend Iraq against the British invasion at that time, and supporting a Sunni rule at that time, which is the Ottoman Empire. At that time, the Shia majority were disenfranchised and marginalized by the Sunni rule of the Ottoman Empire at that time, but they took that stance, the Marja'iyya. During the 70s, the Ayatollah issued a fatwa to stand against any fighting against the Kurds and stop the Shia from enlisting in the Iraqi army. The third fatwa, which is 10 days ago, and that's about calling upon all Iraqis to defend Iraq, all Iraqis to defend Iraq from this vicious terrorist invasion. My question to the panel, is it fair that when we look into these set of 3 fatwas and over the past 100 years, to label them as a Shia-specific fatwa? Because this is kind of like mobilize the whole audience of a very wrong message, even though the fatwa was issued followed by an explanation that all people to basically to answer for the support of Iraq is basically to enlist in the army and in accordance to the law. Thank you.
Nusayba, would you like to take the question about the Kurds?
Really good question. I think the fact that the Iraqi Kurds have been able to occupy Kirkuk is just an absolutely massive development, and I think that it does spell the end of a unified Iraq as we've known it to date. I don't think that the Kurds will declare independence because I don't think they need to. I think at this point they have de facto independence. I think they have the source of revenue that they need to have an economically viable state. I think the kind of intensive diplomacy, political and economic, that they've done with the Turks in particular over the last 5 years is going to pay off hugely with a reduced Turkish opposition to this level of autonomy exercised in Kurdistan. And there just simply isn't the political power or will or the resources in Baghdad to stop this development from happening. And I think we are currently seeing, the boundaries forming of a future independent Kurdish state that will never again be subjected to government from Baghdad.
Toby, would you like to take the oil question?
I'll link it into 3. I mean, on the Kurdish regional government, I think the pipeline, the building of an independent pipeline, the opening of an independent pipeline beyond the territorial control of Baghdad in December, January last year, this year, is the big breakthrough. I think to move to Kirkuk and into the disputed territories, I think it's highly problematic. You could say territorial conquest by the military, which will further destabilize the situation. But I agree, I think a weak and unstable Baghdad is fine for the Kurdish regional government. When relations got very, very bad, it's when Maliki was moving what seemed to be at the time a more coherent an army up to his borders. But let us not forget that there's an ongoing budget dispute, and as yet, the Kurdish regional government can't pump enough oil to make up for the 17% of the national budget they get from Baghdad. I think that's the interregnum. But Ankara, because of its own gas and oil deficit is quite keen to get cheap oil from the KRG. On the south, and it gets the security of the south gets back, I think, to something Haider said. What Nouri al-Maliki has, or what the Iraqi government has done after ISIS seized control of Ramadi and Fallujah and running through to the current crisis, is to use the Sibal Haq, a very sectarian and very violent militia, as political commissars, to strengthen the army as it pushed them up into Anbar and Fallujah. The meta-sizing of this militia will be profoundly difficult, however disciplined they are, if and when this crisis ends. They are operating under the aegis and autonomy, under the blessing of the Prime Minister's government, in a way comparable to the Jaish al-Mahdi under Jafari. And I think trying to put that particular genie back in its box is hugely problematic, which brings us to Louay's question about Sistani's fatwa. I think I'll leave it to you gentlemen to interpret the fatwa. I will interpret the need for a caveated explanation of it a couple of days later as much more intriguing. In a country that lacks the rule of law, that is dominated by violent militias justifying their violence in the name of religious identity, a call to arms, one would have hoped, would have been caveated at its first with a call to join the military, not just a call to arms. And I think that's what we're seeing in the face of understandable panic, with a barbaric group amongst others revolting in the north of the country. We have to be very careful in what's recommended, given that the Iraqi civil war that started in 2004 but was accelerated by the destruction of the Samarra Shrine was primarily driven through sectarian militias slaughtering people not of their own religion.
Just before I get to the Sistani fatwa, I think the oil facilities and Basra in general, I would say to all oil companies to be rest assured. I mean, Basra is nothing like Mosul or Tikrit. And even Baghdad, I think we exaggerate the threat of the ISIS militants. I mean, I can't, and it's not a coincidence that north of Baghdad, places like Balad and Samarra are secure. The local population want nothing to do with ISIS. Basra, though we do have a sizable Sunni minority community, it's dominated by the Shia. And I think that will prevent any sort of major disruption in terms of the oil. With the Sistani issue, I agree with Louay. On Saturday, I did meet with Ayatollah Sistani, and he reiterated, and I thought was even surprised by the exaggeration and the way the media interpreted it. Because even in the original fatwa, not the subsequent clarification, this wasn't a call to arms to join militias or just to pick up guns and go out onto the streets. It was very carefully worded. It was a collective responsibility for all Iraqis, regardless of ethno-sectarian affiliation, to stand with the armed forces and confront terrorism. And when I met him in his office, he went further and he said, this isn't just, because in the first fatwa, there was the words sacred sites. And many people thought he was just talking about the Shia shrines, the ones which are under threat. He actually said, my call to protect the sacred sites isn't just about protecting Shia sacred sites. We need to protect Sunni sacred sites. Abu Hanifa in Baghdad, Gailani, these also being threatened by ISIS. Christian places of worship, churches that are being burnt in Mosul. Sistani sees this in a very nationalistic way in that terms. And as I said, it was unfortunate that it was misinterpreted by the media.
Let's take a few more questions. There was a gentleman there, yeah. And the lady here, and the lady here.
Iraj Bagazadi from IB Tourist and member of Chatham House. I'd just like to come back to the Kurdish question that was raised. We've been discussing this entire ISIS issue in the context of the appalling atrocities and the internal politics of Iraq and so on. What I'd be interested to hear about is what the thoughts are relating to the regional issues which the whole Kurdish autonomy question and the Kurdish aspiration towards independence and so on, what those regional implications are likely to be, both in the case of Turkey and in the case of Iran, not to mention, of course, also Syria. The breakup of Iraq has always been viewed in Iran and Turkey as a potential internal threat to the stability of those countries, and I just wonder how you view that situation now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The lady here. No, it's the behind you. Sorry.
If we're going to end up with 3 federal states in Iraq, is that going to secure an agreement with Iran on their nuclear program? And would that open their markets to Western products?
Thank you. And the lady here, please.
Zara Al-Rikabi, barrister at Brickcourt Chambers and Iraqi by origin. I have 2 questions. I don't know if you'd give me.
If you could stick to one, I'd really appreciate it.
I could bundle them into one.
Bundle away.
I think I spent 6 months in Iraq in 2008, and most of the people I managed to speak to were who could give me an insight into violent areas, if you like, were from Medina al-Sadr, a Mahdi militia stronghold. And they felt very much like hostages in Medina al-Sadr, the people that I spoke to. At one point when clashes with the Americans and the Iraqi government were taking place, this lady went into hysterics at work because she lives in Medina al-Sadr, her daughters are at school, and the Mahdi militia was shooting at the Americans from the girls' school, from the roof. And she said, you know, the Americans will retaliate, my kids could die. What my real fear is with what's happening with Mosul, with the media coverage and with all the analysis, is to what extent are the people of Mosul hostages to both ISIS and the violent Iraqi groups within Mosul? And to what extent are the analysts projecting their own views that this is legitimized by Sunni discontent within Mosul? Because my fear is that we are on the brink of a sectarian catastrophe, possibly, as you've set out. And is it really wise to suggest that Sunnis in Mosul have a role to play in this, a popular role to play in this?
Thank you.
The only other thing I would say very quickly is absent in this discussion is the role of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and I would like to hear about your views in how they have created and fostered sectarianism.
Thank you. Nusayba, would you like to take the last? Let's just start with the last question.
I think you're definitely right about, you know, a significant number of the residents of Mosul feeling like hostages, for sure. I mean, ISIS is so extreme. To even begin to successfully confront them, I mean, can Moslawis really just start to fight back against ISIS? You know, one wrong word and your head's chopped off. So it's not that easy. And you know, we don't want to confuse Sunni passivity in Mosul with endorsement. And I certainly think that ISIS's ideology is so extreme and it's completely alienating for most Iraqi Sunnis, and I really have never heard regular Iraqi Sunnis identifying with it in any way. At the same time, I think that, you know, Toby's narrative about how the breakaway and the alienation of the wider Sunni community set the stage for this. And that doesn't mean that we should confuse ISIS as being the army of Iraqi Sunnis. What happened is the alienation created a vacuum of authority and a vacuum of legitimacy. ISIS haven't successfully filled that. They're not considered legitimate. They're not representative of those residents. And, you know, I really think that the residents of Mosul and all of the areas in which ISIS manages to exert control are going to be by far the biggest losers from all of this, because to express any kind of opposition to ISIS has appalling results. But also, by virtue of just living in these areas where ISIS has control, when we inevitably see fight back from the central Iraqi government, if we see bombing by the Americans, they're also going to be treated as collaborators with ISIS. And I think that that's going to be one of the most important things the Iraqi government can do in its response to this ISIS takeover, is to try its best to differentiate between the Iraqi civilians who live there and who don't want any part of this, and between the hardcore fighters who really don't represent Iraqi Sunnism.
Just for the second question on Turkey, I genuinely do believe Turkey today is playing the exact same dirty game that Assad played with Iraq. And Turkey is playing this game with both Syria and Iraq. And the rules are very simple. I open up my borders, I let these extremists go somewhere else, and by doing that, I can ensure my enemies are kept busy. And as long as they're dying somewhere else, it's not a problem for me. And this will backfire, and I think there will be blowback, and the Turks and other states who are facilitating the flow of literally ISIS. I mean, my friend on a plane went to Antakya, and some guy next to him said, "Oh, you fellow jihadist from Britain." But the interesting thing, the interesting thing is when they landed, they were official facilitators for these jihadi groups within sight of the Turkish intelligence. "Oh, are you Mohammed from Bradford? Are you, Ahmed from Manchester?" It's that open, and I think the Turks now are sort of making it harder. But very briefly, it's not just Saudi. It's not just Saudi Arabia where private donors and money is flowing to these groups. And it's not just ISIS. It's to Al-Qaeda as well, who are fighting ISIS. Qatar, Kuwait probably more so than Qatar and Saudi. And this is why I do believe if the West seriously wants to combat and seriously wants to win the war on terror, one place they can start, if they don't want to get their hands dirty and get involved, through military intervention, one place they can start is by putting more pressure on Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, on Kuwait, to cut off the flow, and it's endless flow of money going to these groups.
Toby? There was one question from the lady that we haven't addressed.
Nusayba mentioned learning from the best practices of counterinsurgency doctrine. And counterinsurgency doctrine starts from the understanding that a population that isn't catered for by its government, that isn't treated equally by its government, that cannot get government services, that aren't treated like citizens, are alienated from that government, and then either passive when something like ISIS comes to town, or showing its distaste for its government by mobilization and demonstration, which is exactly what happened across the whole of the north and northwest from December, January onwards through, until the Iraqi army suppressed those peaceful demonstrations in March, April, and then again in December after Rafi al-Assad was expelled from the cabinet or driven from the cabinet. Now, Mosul has never fully been controlled by the Iraqi government. So the lives of Mosalis have been held from 2003 onwards. And ISIS and its predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, has been operating in a more or less permissive atmosphere directly because of the weakness of the Iraqi state in Mosul. So ISIS have been killing local government muqtars, local government representatives on the ground. It's been racketeering, extracting money from the people of Mosul. So of course, they're not going to welcome ISIS. But if you look at the key interviews given by a broad section of Mosalis after ISIS left, they were, after the Iraqi government soldiers left, they were not expressing backing or affection for the Iraqi government. This is a huge problem for Baghdad, and it's a huge problem that it's not able to project its power into areas of the country where its rule, I think, has been systematically rejected. Now, to get to the regional issue, Turkish policy towards Iraq is ambiguous, shall we say, and towards Syria has been overt, but they're not the only ones to call for the removal of Assad. I think Turkish policy toward the Kurdish regional government has been somewhat in flux. They clearly have an energy deficit that they see they can fully or partially fulfill from the Kurdish regional government's exports. They have encouraged the building of that pipeline, and they allowed oil to be pumped to Turkish ports through it, and it's only recently been sold. What's that, 5 months out? So it's been sitting on dockside for 5 months. So you can see an ambiguity there. I think the wider regional ramifications, of which Iraq is a target but not the cause, clearly we have in the Middle East a Cold War between a series of states that are using religion to justify their competition. On one side, Saudi Arabia, to a certain extent, Turkey and Qatar, although clearly these are not a unified front, on the other Iran. Now, as an international relations scholar, I see nothing new with that. That is the competition of states. What is new is the use of sectarian rhetoric, overt, powerful, from 2003 onwards to justify that. And that is destabilizing, it's painful, and it's causing a lot of grief and death. So, of course, Turkey, Saudi, Iran, Qatar are dealing in this destabilization as a tool of foreign policy. To some extent, though, this could be overstressed. This is because the US has decided to limit its role in the region, and so the regional powers are operating more autonomously. So you can see the outcome of this, where this is leading in terms of the profound destabilization in Syria and Iraq. I don't know. What the answer to this would be to say to all governments, not just the Iraqi government, that investing in the legal, rational delivery of services to your population in the name of citizenship would do a lot to close down the space for your regional rivals to destabilize your own government through the subversion of your population. But that's a difficult thing to do. That's about investing in services, in schools, in power, something that states all over the world have. Destabilizing your rivals through the relatively cheap promotion of incredibly vicious sectarian ideology is an easy solution to power plays, I would have thought.
Thank you, Toby. I think we can take 2 more questions. There's a young gentleman there who's been very patient.
Hello, my name is Hussein from the School of Oriental and African Studies. My question is to Mr. Haider. I would like to ask him about how would you explain some of the recent hostile statements from some Shia clerics against the Kurds, and especially yesterday's video message by Qais al-Khazali, who directly threatened even all the Kurdish citizens who are inhabiting in Baghdad. He clearly said that they should be careful, they've been warned, and they either leave or their interest is and their lives will be in danger because we're not going to be responsible what's going to happen to them from now on.
Thank you. There's a young man, and then we'll take one last one there.
Adnan Kocha from Kurdish Culture Center. I think ICS Daesh is not new for us. It's a continuation of Ansar Sunnah, were established in Iran 2001. The Kurd faced Ansar Sunnah before that. Ansar Sunnah was supported by Iran in the beginning, so we fight that before. And it's been 2 years where the Kurd in Syria fighting against Daesh, ICS.
Can you give us your question?
Yeah, the question is the problem in Iraq is not about today. Iraq established an agreement of London Conference in 2001, where Maliki was a minority. Now Maliki, he thinks that he's majority of the Shia. In the time was a Talabani and Barzani. Now it's only Barzani in the power. The Sunnis, there was...
What is your question?
So the question is, I think, why the Shia think they are majority while there's no evidence they are majority. So
Thank you. Thank you. We're just going to go very quickly to one final question.
Thank you. Since Abbas, Iraqi Turkmen representative to UK. After fall of Mosul, all the places that have been targeted, like Tel Afar, Bashir, and Biraucha, all this line which is divided the Kurds, Arabs, and it's all dominated by Turkmen. And we are hearing very horrifying stories like more than 2,000 people, Turkmen, they are left their town from Tel Afar, and the other horrific killing stories as well. The question is it the plan to sweep up the Turkmen from these places? It's going to be easier to divide Iraq to Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. Thank you.
Haider.
First question with regards to hostile statements from Shia clerics. You just mentioned Qais al-Khazali. I'm not sure if there is anybody else, but Qais al-Khazali is the leader of the Asab al-Haq militia. And he isn't a serious scholar. Nobody does take him seriously in terms of his religious credentials. Certainly people don't take religious guidance from him. That's not to play down or even justify. I'm just saying he's not taken seriously within the Shia community. He's the head of a small militia in Iraq. The second question about the Shia majority, I mean, there is no recent census, and it's difficult to put a precise number. It's genuinely taken. I think the CIA fact book says the Shia in Iraq are 60 to 65%. How accurate that is not for me to say. But if you look at the just recent elections, if you add up the votes and tally of the Shia parties, and bear in mind there were Shia who are running on secular leftist lists, it is over 50%.
I don't think it's ever been disputed.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Actually, some Sunni politicians do say the Sunnis are the majority, but of course they lump themselves together with the Kurds, and the Kurds don't want, to be lumped together with the Sunni Arabs.
But these are your last words.
Yeah, just a quick note on this Ansar Sunnah in Kurdistan. Of course, the Kurdish region suffered terribly at the hands of Ansar Sunnah, which is an extremist group that had territory in and resources from Iran. And I think something that the Kurdish regional government is perhaps wildly underestimating and should be much, much more worried about is sharing an enormous border with ISIS and the potential for the renewal of Islamist extremist attacks in Kurdish territory that the Kurds suffered with for a long time and have been lucky to manage to secure their territory since 2003 against this group. But I think that it's not at all beyond the pale of possibility that that could start happening again, and it's something the Kurds need to take under consideration when they're deciding whether or not to cooperate with the Iraqi central government in combating this threat.
Right, I think the last thought I'll leave you with is
Could you also address the Turkmen?
And the Turkmen, I will get to that. The crisis that Iraq is living through today is a direct result of the profound crisis of the state that was built in the aftermath of regime change. A state that's failed to deliver security, equality, citizenship, running water, electricity to the vast majority of its population. In that vacuum, those that are most vulnerable, the minority Christian population, those that are easily identifiable to be persecuted by the extremely violent groups like ISIS, will be driven from the country. How we get out of this crisis or how the Iraqis get out of this crisis, is to rebuild that state, to drive institutions into society that interact with Iraqis as equals, that reconstructs a robust Iraqi nationalism that knitted the vast majority of Iraqis together from the creation of the state through until at least the 90s, if not longer, and then builds a democracy that doesn't seek to exclude, it seeks to include on the basis of citizenship, not religious identity. And now that's hugely difficult. And the Iraqis, like states around the world, have failed to do it. The Americans failed to do it for the Iraqis. But there's no other solution. To talk about, to demonize ISIS as the central problem, I think, is to miss the point that the fertile soil in which this bunch of crazies grew. And unless you drain that soil, unless you give ordinary Iraqis something to live for and something to fight for, something to vote for, then this violent instability will go on.
Thank you very much, our three speakers, and I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions. Thank you.